Hey, AP Eagles, last video of the week. We're going to go ahead and wrap up Unit 6 today, and that will leave us just with Unit 7 for the beginning of next week. And that'll be a quick one for us because, again, that's the most recent topics that we covered from American imperialism, World War I, Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, New Deal programs, those kinds of things. So that's fresh. You guys have those note packets too, so if you need to refer to those, you actually have them already. But let's jump in here. We're on page 21, and we're starting into the Gilded Age, which is sort of our last topic of Unit 6. I did throw the progressive era in here as well because I feel like that goes directly along with the Gilded Age, right? Because the Gilded Age and American industrialization is what creates the issues and the problems that will lead to those progressive era reforms. So kind of a direct cause and effect kind of thing here. But let's jump into page 21, and we're going to break down the Gilded Age into sort of like categories. So page 21 is the economics of the Gilded Age. One of the things that you guys need to keep in mind about the Gilded Age is that throughout this time period, the US government is still practicing this policy of laissez-faire, right? Being hands off the economy. As time goes by, we will start to see those reformers starting to push for more action by the government in regulating the economy. But as the Gilded Age starts, the government is very laissez-faire. First bullet point, though, starts with technology of the Gilded Age. Again, what you're going to want to do with that bullet point is basically talk about the factory technology, but also talk about the growth of skyscrapers, right? That's a form of technology. Streetcars, right, which are going to connect suburbs, which is sort of a new concept at this time. Middle-class people living in the suburbs, working-class people living in the city and the urban areas, but now they're going to have streetcars, which are going to be able to connect people from the suburbs, allow them to live there, but also commute into the cities. Those middle-class people working in those factory ownership and management positions and lawyers and those types of things, okay? So technology, the Gilded Age, don't just think factory technology, and maybe you want to look up a couple specific examples of factory technology, but also think about transportation and architecture and those types of things. Next bullet point talks about monopolies and trusts. Remember, monopoly is the concept of owning or dominating one particular type of industry. So one business dominates an entire industry. Trust is very similar, except instead of one business dominating the entire industry, it's maybe like 2 or 3 businesses together sort of dominating an entire industry. But the concept is sort of the same for both. Monopolies and trusts, what they do is they cut out or destroy competition so that one business, or in the case of a trust, a few not small businesses, but a few businesses can dominate an entire industry, destroy the competition, and then control prices and production of goods in that industry, okay? And of course, you guys have your famous industrialists that are known for this, and we'll get to those guys in just a second. But knowing what a monopoly and trust is good, and also understanding that these are things that are going to be attacked and regulated as we move forward, especially by guys like Teddy Roosevelt, who's going to be the trust buster, right? Looking to break down these trust monopolies because they're bad for Americans. They're bad for consumers, right? When competition is cut out, it's bad for us, all right? Because we know that oftentimes price gouging and those types of things will take place when monopolies exist, okay? Monopolies are formed in a variety of different ways. We talked about vertical integration and horizontal integration, and that's our next topic in your notes. Remember, the idea of vertical integration is the idea of owning an entire industry from the early stages all the way up to the finished product. Sorry, I'm trying to get on the screen there. Okay, so if I am in the business of steel production, right? I buy the mines, right, at the bottom. I buy the railroads that move the product from the mines. I own the factories that produce the steel. I own the the facilities where the steel is stored. I own the stores and businesses that sell the steel. So I own the entire business, which basically means every step of the process, I'm the one making money. Okay, most famous person known for vertical integration is going to be Carnegie, right? Carnegie was known for owning, the entire process. The next one is horizontal integration, right? Horizontal integration, and this is what Rockefeller was known for. Rockefeller creates this one big company, Standard Oil Company, and what he does is all the other oil companies that were sort of on his plane, he's going to go out and sort of gobble up all those. So basically, he owns all of the businesses, gobbles them up and destroys them. That's known as horizontal integration. And just so you guys know, both horizontal and vertical integration are going to be examples of how monopolies are formed. All right, so these are business practices that eventually, not right away, but eventually the government is going to look to regulate and get rid of. Okay, famous capitalists, of course, you got Rockefeller. He's known for the Standard Oil Company and all those sort of sneaky business techniques that he used, bribing, threatening competition, those types of things. Carnegie is known for steel, right? Carnegie is also going to be known for philanthropy. All of those guys did do it, but Carnegie's going to be more known for it. And actually, I'm going to jump to the next bullet point, partly because of how he promoted it. Remember, Carnegie is going to be the author of the Gospel of Wealth. And in the Gospel of Wealth, he basically talks about this idea that having wealthy industrialists is not a bad thing. He's trying to prove this to people, that having wealthy industrialists and people that create these monopolies, it's not a bad thing, as long as those wealthy industrialists understand their responsibility, that once they have this enormous wealth, their responsibility is to basically uplift all of society. And the way that you do that is not by handing out money to people, but by investing or donating in the form of, colleges and libraries, creating these institutions where people, if they are willing to work hard and educate themselves, can go and hopefully eventually raise their status in society too. And that's the whole concept of the Gospel of Wealth, is that wealthy industrialists should donate their money, not in the form of handouts, but in the form of essentially opportunities for people to better themselves, and then society rises as a whole. All right, there were two more guys in the bullet point above that. J.P. Morgan, remember, he's the king of finance, but because J.P. Morgan is known as the banks and finance, he's going to have his hands in a lot of different industries. Remember, he eventually buys out Carnegie Steel. He buys out huge portions of the railroads. So J.P. Morgan's going to have his hands in a lot of different industries. And then, of course, Ford, right? Henry Ford with the Model T and the Ford Motor Company. Remember, Henry Ford, besides being a wealthy industrialist, is also going to be known for being a little bit more progressive than some of these other guys. Remember, he's the guy that ultimately came up with that $5 a day, $5 work day, where he basically said anybody that works at the Ford Motor Company will earn at least $5 a day, even down to the lowliest worker. $5 a day is going to be a guarantee at this company. And you could say that his vision for the $5 day is almost like an early version of the concept of minimum wage, that every person, regardless of what position they hold, should be guaranteed at least a set wage. Okay? All right, so that's some of the economics of the Gilded Age. But the one thing that I would really want to just make sure sticks out in your mind, don't forget that the big reason that the economics, right, that the businesses are functioning the way they are during the Gilded Age is because the government is hands off, because this is a laissez-faire capitalist society. And that's what allows all of these changes to take place in the form of those wealthy industrialists and the creation of those monopolies and those types of things, okay? Now, even though wealthy industrialists are the ones that look like they sort of hold all the power and wealth, which they do, understand that the Gilded Age is very much built on the backs of the laborers of this time period. Okay, so even though factory workers are part of the working class and the lower class people, these workers are what makes the factories and industrialization go. Okay, so don't forget, yes, during the Gilded Age, the standard of living is increasing. So everyone's life is sort of improving to a certain level, but the gap between the rich and the poor at the same time is very much growing. All right, the rich are becoming richer, and the poor are becoming poorer. And that's where it talks about describe the living and working conditions. Well, you guys know this. Wealthy people and middle class people are living in the suburbs. Women are staying at home. men are going off to work, and children are going to school and being educated, and they get to live in these nice neighborhoods outside of the cities, right? Getting good paying jobs, where the working class, and that's the part that you can really describe well, right? Working class, living in urban areas, poverty, long working hours, low pay, dangerous conditions, child labor, right? Mom and dad off working because the wages are so low. That oftentimes leaves the kids either to go and work in the factories themselves, all right, at a very young age, or be at home by themselves, which leads to, kids sort of wandering the streets. The poverty can lead to urban crime. So when you're talking about the living conditions and working conditions for the working class, that's something that you guys know and can describe well. Okay, because of these conditions, eventually we'll see the formation of labor unions. I would not be surprised if your DBQ essay is on the labor movement during the Gilded Age. It might be something like, to what extent was the labor movement, right, labor unions, successful in making political and economic changes during the Gilded Age, right? So you're going to have to talk about labor unions, talk about the tactics they used, and whether or not they were successful in making change. If you do get that, the Knights of Labor and the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, are your two most famous labor unions in American history. Knights of Labor, not nearly as successful, but it is your first major union. Remember, they're the ones that allow in unskilled laborers. They're the ones that said that they were not interested in going on strike. They're somewhat poorly organized and led, and the Knights of Labor will never really take off. That's sort of a failed labor union, but because it is one of the first major ones, you do have to give it some credit, right? You got to have that first step. AFL is going to be much more successful, only skilled laborers, and are willing to use strikes and different tactics to force management into negotiating with them, okay? And if you're going to talk about labor unions, you also have to talk about the events that are associated with them. So of course you have events like your Haymarket riot in Chicago. Remember, that's the one that went terribly wrong. You have these anarchists in the crowd. A bunch of police officers will die when a couple bombs go off. And the newspapers will blame the labor union for what happened there. And the Haymarket riot weakens the labor movement, weakens labor unions, because Americans will side with management over the unions because the unions look reckless and they look violent. Same thing's going to happen in that Homestead strike. Remember, Carnegie owns Homestead Steel. You're going to have the workers go on strike. Pinkerton detectives are going to be brought in. Violence breaks out. And again, the newspapers will report it in a way where it makes the labor unions and the workers look like violent sort of anarchists. And Americans will side once again with Carnegie and with management. The event that really, though, helps the labor movement gain some steam and momentum is that Pullman Palace car strike. Remember, that's the one where the railroad cars, right, Pullman Palace car, the workers go on strike for higher wages. And the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, has to step in because he says that the fact that the railroads aren't running is preventing the delivery of the U.S. mail. And U.S. mail is the responsibility of the U.S. government, so they have to step in and force the workers back to work, and they brought in U.S. troops to do this. This is the one, though, because the government gets involved and forces the workers to go back to work under the pressure of federal troops, that finally the American people will look at these workers and go, poor workers, that's really tough. It's the first major event in the labor movement where the American people side with the workers over management, okay? All right. If you're going to talk about labor during the Gilded Age, you have to talk about immigrants. And in the notes, this is where I wanted you guys to kind of outline some of the concepts of immigration. Now, again, I would not be surprised if the DBQ essay is about immigration. Describe the extent to which immigration patterns changed in the late 1800s during the Gilded Age and the impact that it had. All right, so got to know immigration. And remember, starts with the old immigrants. Old immigrants are from Western Europe. mainly Irish and Germans. Of course, the Irish coming because of the Irish potato famine. The Irish tended to settle on the coast. Germans tended to move inland because they had a little bit more money. For the most part, coming for economic opportunities, and in the case of the Germans, some political reasons too. Okay. The new immigrants, though, remember the new immigrants are coming from a different location. They're coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. And these immigrants look a little bit different from those Western European immigrants, right? And because they look a little bit different and they speak different languages and they're coming with different religions, nativism is gonna really start to amp up in the late 1800s. And there's gonna be Americans that are really gonna push for immigration reforms, right? Immigration restrictions. And that first one is gonna come out with that nativist sentiment. The first major immigration reform that's going to be made comes in the 1880s with that Chinese Exclusion Act. But remember, that is just the beginning of a series of acts, and it's over the course of a larger amount of time, but a series of acts that look to limit immigration. You have that Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. In the early 1900s, you have the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, where we made an agreement basically with the Japanese government that they would limit the number of Japanese people coming to the United States. In the 1920s is where we had that whole Quota Act thing that you guys researched, where only 2 to 3% of the immigrants from a certain country that had already come into the United States in a year prior could come in the next year, and so on. So immigration reform and immigration laws are something that we start to see with the Chinese Exclusionary Act, but will sort of be a theme moving forward. And again, it has to do with nativism, that fear of foreigners and foreign ideas sort of infiltrating into the United States. And part of the reason that people had this great nativist fear at this time was because they were worried that the new immigrants in particular seemed to want to keep their traditional way of life. People want to believe what they want to believe. That seems fine, right? But for many Americans at this time, it was, if you're going to be in America, you got to be American. And they wanted to sort of force assimilation on these immigrants. And oftentimes, the more they tried to force assimilation, the more the immigrants resisted. So that's where nativism sort of comes from at this time period. I did throw Jane Addams in here as well. She could go in the Progressive Era page, but I thought she's sort of early. She's in the 1880s, a little bit before the Progressive Era, and her work deals specifically with the new immigrants, so I thought she fit in well here. Remember, Jane Addams is the creator of what is known as the Hull House, Hull. The Hull House was in Chicago, and it's an example of a larger movement known as the Settlement House movement. And the Settlement House, the concept of it is that these organizations should be established where when someone new from the country, an immigrant, comes, they can basically be put in a situation to be successful. So for example, new immigrant goes to a settlement house. Perhaps at the settlement house, they teach them how to speak English, right? And how to read and write. At the settlement house, they might give them a place to sleep until they can kind of get on their feet. Provide maybe some food. Also, maybe some economic opportunities, maybe some jobs. We can help you find a job, right? Help you get onto your feet. So a settlement house is meant to sort of help immigrants sort of get the ball rolling here in the United States, okay? And Jane Addams is sort of famous for starting this Hull House and taking this settlement house movement, which had already existed in Europe, by the way, but taking this movement and bringing it here to the United States. Okay, what do we got? 2 more left. Okay, politics of the Gilded Age. Don't forget those political machines. William Boss Tweed, the most famous one being Tammany Hall. Remember these political machines, speaking of immigrants, these are the guys that provided services to the immigrants, knowing eventually that the immigrants would become citizens and gain the right to vote, and once they could vote, they would vote in the people that helped them initially. And that's where William Boss Tweed was able to become this powerful figure in New York City politics. He gave to the immigrants, right? And in return, when they eventually could vote, they would continue to vote him into office again and again and again. And this is known as a very corrupt practice You know, eventually William Boss Tweed will be taken down for being corrupt, for lining his own pockets, for stealing New York City tax dollars in order to keep himself into power. But these political machines, that's how they're built, right? Provide to the immigrants, be their friends, give them what they need to get started, and then they will get all the political power because of it. Okay. Next bullet point was the purpose of assimilation. How did it apply to immigrants? We sort of already covered that. Remember, assimilation was what many Americans believed immigrants should be doing when they came to the United States. But a lot of these new immigrants wanted to keep their traditional culture, language, religions. So that idea of wanting them to assimilate actually creates more tension between nativists and the immigrants that want to keep their traditional culture and language and so on. Okay. Social Darwinism is a phrase that you might just throw into a DBQ essay if you guys get the topic of the Gilded Age. Social Darwinism, you might remember from global studies, but that was that whole idea of survival of the fittest. And it very much goes along with laissez-faire, right? Wealthy industrials will look out for themselves. Poor workers won't be defended by the government or anybody else. So it's the idea of social Darwinism. The wealthy will be powerful and the poor will be poor, and survival of the fittest, that this is how it's supposed to be. As the government becomes less laissez-faire and they become more involved in the economy, social Darwinism and a lot of those beliefs will sort of start to fade. And that's the next part, right? Define laissez-faire. How did the concept create problems of the Gilded Age? Again, without government regulation, these businesses, these wealthy industrialists have no rules. They can do whatever they want to make money. And if that means abusing their workers to do it, obviously they will. Okay? Eventually, the government will respond by starting to get more involved, starting to put those regulations, and we do start to see laissez-faire start to fade away. And that happens first in the 1890s with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which didn't work, remember, as well as we had hoped it would. But the Sherman Antitrust Act lays the foundation for the later act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. And that one much more successful in regulating monopolies and trusts. Okay. Finally, if you're talking politics of the Gilded Age, do not forget the Grange, right? The national Grange of the patrons of husbandry. I think I had that right. Okay. More commonly just referred to as the Grange. The farmers, right? Remember, it was a social organization first because farmers were separated from each other and wanted a chance to socialize. But the more they socialized, the more farmers realized the problems that they were all having. And they were all having very similar problems. Problems with railroad rates, problems with banks and loans, and those types of things. And that will lead to, right, the Grange sort of shifts into a more political movement, which becomes known as the populist movement or the populist party or the People's Party, right? So it's known by multiple things. And the Omaha platform in 1892, that is sort of their when they burst onto the scene, the Omaha platform, and this third party, this new one, the People's Party, the Populist Party, starts promoting all their ideas. Remember, they had a bunch of ideas. Government regulation of railroad rates, government regulation of banking and loans. But they also wanted things like direct election of senators. They wanted a graduated income tax. Remember, this is also where they start to hint at that idea of a bimetallic standard. And that's what's going to become really the number one issue for the populists in the 1896 election when William Jennings Bryan is running for office. And he will give that famous Cross of Gold speech. Remember, we read it. We will not put upon the American people this cross of gold. And that crown of thorns. And basically what he's saying is that the gold standard had become a burden on the American people. We had to use silver too. But remember, that's never going to happen. William Jennings Bryan loses that election. And shortly after he loses the election, there's a massive discovery of gold in Alaska. And they are able to have more gold and have more money within our system. And the whole bimetallic standard thing just poof goes away forever with that Federal Reserve Act that came out in 1900, basically clarifying once and for all that gold is our standard for our currency. I know this is a longer video, but I didn't get it in last night, so I had to make sure I got last night's material and today's material in here. So sorry this is a little bit long, but your last one is page 24, and that's the Progressive Era. Now, I do want to tell you guys, I don't know this for sure, but I don't think this will be your topic. And the reason I don't think this will be your topic is because last year in 2019, this was the topic of the DBQ essay. It would be very unlikely for the DBQ essay to be on the same time period and topic 2 years in a row, okay? With that being said, if you do get an essay about the Gilded Age, they might want to talk about the problems and some of the reforms that helped fix those problems. So maybe you do end up talking about the Progressive Era. So let's just go over it quickly. Remember, progressive, it's all about progress, right? The Gilded Age created issues. The Progressive Era is about trying to deal with those issues from the Gilded Age. You have famous muckrakers. Remember, muckrakers initially was a sort of negative nickname created by Teddy Roosevelt towards these investigative journalists and writers who kept exposing the problems of the Gilded Age. And initially, Teddy Roosevelt didn't really like them because they were sort of like pessimists. These people always digging up all this dirt, trying to make us look bad and try to make the Gilded Age look bad. But they were right. There were a lot of problems there. And eventually Teddy Roosevelt realizes that and really becomes the leader of the progressive era as far as presidents go. And now we know Taft was very involved in the progressive movement as well, and even Wilson. But Teddy Roosevelt's probably the one that people think of the most. He is the trust buster. He is the guy that came up with the square deal. Remember that labor, consumers, factory owners, everybody can get a square deal. Everyone can get their fair shot in what's fair to them. The goal of the Progressive Era, again, is making progress. It's always good to sort of have your famous muckrakers and writers, the actions they took, the effects. So we just kind of got our list here. We got Thomas Nast, political cartoonist. He's the guy that ends up taking down William Boss Tweed. So he used his political cartoons to take down this super corrupt political official. Jacob Riis, he's the guy that wrote How the Other Half Lives, right? Took those famous photographs of New York City slums and the conditions that immigrants had to live in. And that book, How the Other Half Lives, led to legislation tearing down some of the nastiest tenements in all of New York City, leading to regulations for apartment buildings and living conditions. Certain numbers of people can live in an apartment, and pushing for better plumbing and sewage systems and fresh water and those types of things. Upton Sinclair is probably the easiest one. The Jungle. He writes that book about the meatpacking industry. It leads to some major legislation, including the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. After Teddy Roosevelt reads the book, realizes that it's true, and pushes for those legislation. Ida Tarbell, she's the one that wrote The History of the Standard Oil Company, exposing all the ruthless tactics of John Rockefeller, eventually leading to that very famous court case of U.S. versus Standard Oil, which forced Rockefeller to break up his monopoly. And then you have Ida B. Wells in there too. Ida B. Wells, African-American woman. So recognize that the reformers of this time period, you have some men, you have women, you have African-Americans, including Ida B. Wells, but don't forget some of those other guys. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois could also fit in this time period. Again, those people, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, working for rights for African Americans, trying to promote greater equality and opportunity for African Americans. Ida B. Wells was the journalist who exposed the massive amounts of lynchings that were taking place in the United States in the early 1900s, tried to expose that so that the government could do a better job of protecting African Americans in this country, okay? And then the last one there, guys, what significant laws and amendments were passed during the Progressive Era? We already mentioned some of them, laws on the tenements and Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, but don't forget some of our amendments too. the direct election of senators makes our process more democratic. You have the graduated income tax. You only pay the income tax on the amount of money you earn. So people that earn more will pay a higher amount. People that earn less will pay a lower amount. It's more fair, more equitable. You also have some of those other ideas like referendum and recall and initiative. And don't forget, as I'm sort of saying all these things, that a bunch of those ideas, those ones that I sort of said at the end there, a lot of those ideas came from the Populist Party. Remember we said about third political parties. They don't always win elections, but oftentimes the third parties are the ones that generate a lot of the ideas that even when the party fails to gain office, those ideas stick around, and the two major political parties now have to absorb these ideas and sort of find a way to answer the bell. Third parties oftentimes call out the politicians in the two political parties, the top dogs, and force them to have to deal with the issues that they bring up. Long video today, guys. Hopefully you could break it up into chunks if you needed to over the course of the weekend. Get yourself set up for Monday. I will check in with you guys then. If you have any questions now or have any questions for me between now and then, feel free to shoot me a message or an email. And remember, the DBQ essay that is posted tonight, that one's not due till right before the exam. I want you guys to decide when you want to do that one. It's not due on Sunday. But find a time when you feel most comfortable saying, I'm going to do one last practice exam before the real one on May 15th. And put everything you got into that last practice essay, because, man, it would feel so good to just nail one last practice essay right before you go in to do the real thing and go in with some confidence, feeling good about your writing skills and knowing that you know what you have to do, which you guys do. So crunch time here, last 7 days. All right, have a good weekend, and I will touch base with you guys next week.